Hi, we're out on our range today, and once again we're talking about 38 special ammunition selection for concealed carry. We've done this on several previous occasions, but recently some viewers have sent me some different 38 special ammunition, so here we are again. Now, this comes with two very important caveats. One, although I am going to cover some things that I think will be good information, today's presentation will be tedious and dry. And two, because we're talking about concealed carry, I'm going to use a handgun or handguns with 1 7/8 inch barrels. I find that when people are using 38 special for concealed carry, some kind of snub nose is what's most common. Now, the ammunitions I have are, to start with, Remington Green and Yellow Box 38 Special 158 grain round nose lead. I also have Remington Green and Yellow Box 38 Special Plus P 158 grain semi-wad cutter hollow point. And we're going to want to see, with the 158 grain projectiles, how much more velocity are we getting out of the Plus P than out of the standard pressure. And we're going to want to see that with 158 grain projectiles, is the 38 Special Plus P going to be able to get us above expansion threshold. We'll also compare that to our Federal Premium 38 Special Plus P 158 grain Nyclad semi-wad cutter hollow point. And while we're talking about wad cutters, I have this Federal high power ammunition, that's not Plus P, 38 Special 148 grain wad cutter. Now, what's the difference between a wad cutter and a semi-wad cutter? Let me show you a close-up look. Here on your left is a 38 Special semi-wad cutter, and on your right is a wad cutter. Now, it looks like an empty casing, but you can see that the projectile is completely within the casing, and it's basically flat across the front. And that's the difference between semi-wad cutter and wad cutter. So what's the purpose of a wad cutter? Okay, because of its flat-nosed configuration, it can cut nice clean holes in paper targets, as opposed to the jagged holes you might get from other projectile designs. That makes your target easier to score for target competitions. But there are some people, especially old-school 38 shooters, that think that a wad cutter might be really good for anti-personnel purposes. And different people will tell you different things. But the basic gist of it is that hollow points are velocity-based. The faster you propel them, the more expansion you'll get up to a point. Propel a hollow point too slowly, it'll drop below expansion threshold, and it won't expand at all. 38 Special is a relatively low velocity round, even more so in the snub nose guns you use for concealed carry. And so with ammunitions that might not give you good hollow point expansion out of your snub nose revolver, there are those that think that a semi-wad cutter or a wad cutter, which isn't dependent on velocity to do its thing, might be a better alternative. And because the wad cutter is flat-nosed, you have to compare that to a round-nosed projectile in the same way that you'd compare a boat going through the water will cut through the water pretty well. But if you propelled that boat backwards with its flat back, it's obviously going to dispel a lot more water. The wad cutter, with its flat-nosed configuration, is going to displace a lot more tissue, do a lot more damage than a round-nosed bullet would. At least that's the thought. And we'll see if we can put that to the test. Now, we also have Spear Gold Dot 38 Special Plus P 135 grain gold dot hollow point. And finally, we have Hornady Critical Defense 38 Special Plus P 110 grain FTX projectile, like a ballistic tip, versus Hornady Critical Defense Lite 38 Special with an 80 grain FTX projectile, like a ballistic tip. So will the Critical Defense Lite compare favorably with the Critical Defense? We'll see if we can put that to the test. And we'll start with some tedious chronograph analysis, and we'll start with our Remington ammunition. I have the chronograph set up at 7 yards, and I have my Smith & Wesson Model 638 with a 1 7/8 inch barrel loaded with the Remington Green and Yellow Box 38 Special 158 grain round nose lead. $690. $705. Duplicate 705. $677. and 695. Now let's see how that compares to the 158 grain plus P. Now we have our Remington Green and Yellow Box 38 Special plus P 158 grain semi-wad cutter hollow point. Let's see if we get any more velocity. $782. $773. $784. $806. And $777. Let's go crunch those numbers. So with our standard pressure 158 grain round nose lead, we get a mean velocity of 694. With our plus P 158 grain semi-wad cutter hollow point, a mean velocity of 784. That's 90 feet per second more. And when you're talking about velocities down there in the 700 range, 90 feet per second more is a lot more. Now let's try another type of ammo. Now I'm loaded with the Federal Premium 38 Special plus P 158 grain Nyclad semi-wad cutter hollow point. So let's see how the Federal plus P 158 grain compares with the Remington. $780. $777. $756. $788. And $791. And now our Spear Gold Dot 38 Special plus P 135 grain Gold Dot hollow point. $839. $807. $825. $854. And $799. Let's try another type of ammo. And now our Federal High Power 38 Special 148 grain wad cutter. $651. $655. $667. $654. And $668. Those were really consistent. But let's try another type of ammo. Now our Hornady Critical Defense 38 Special plus P 110 grain FTX projectile, like a ballistic tip. $981. $949. $984. $958. And $925. Now let's compare that to our Critical Defense Lite. And finally, our Hornady Critical Defense Lite, which is 38 Special standard pressure with an 80 grain FTX projectile, like a ballistic tip. $943. $915. $953. $907. And $946. Now, let's go crunch the numbers. Well, I crunched the numbers, and here they are. And of course, it comes with the normal caveats that chronographs don't always agree with each other, and certain environmental factors like ambient temperature and elevation can affect chronograph results. One other thing I'd like to add is that as you look at these numbers, they're probably significantly lower than the numbers you've seen on ballistics charts or advertised on the box. Remember, these numbers were achieved with a 1 7/8 inch barrel, not the much longer barrel that's typically used to create the ballistics chart. Okay, with that, if you look at our Remington green and yellow box, 158 grain round nose lead, we see a velocity of 694 feet per second. That doesn't sound like very much. And it's not. Remember, that's just old school, low pressure round nose lead. But when we look at our Remington green and yellow box, plus P 158 grain projectile, we see 784, an increase of 90 feet per second. That's a lot more. So the question we had was, when you go from the Remington standard pressure to the Remington plus P, will you get a significant increase in velocity? Yes. Another question is, we look at our Federal 158 grain plus P, and we get a velocity of 778. That's 6 feet per second less than what we got with the Remington within the variation of one round to the next, not enough difference to make a difference. But the question was, how would the Remington plus P 158 grain compare to another type of plus P 158 grain? Looks like they're going to be pretty even. Now, when we go from there to our Hornady Critical Defense to our Hornady Critical Defense Lite, we see that with our Hornady Critical Defense plus P 110 grain projectile, a velocity of 959 feet per second. With our Hornady Critical Defense Lite and its 80 grain projectile, 933. That's 26 feet per second less, which you could argue is within the variation of one round to the next. And is it really enough difference to make a difference? You know, maybe. But remember that our Critical Defense Lite achieves that velocity with an 80 grain projectile, not 110 grain. And so if I've done my math right, when we look at our energy foot-pounds, we see that our Hornady Critical Defense has 224, Critical Defense Lite 154. That's 70 pounds less. I'm going to say significantly less. And when you compare that 224 to the 212 we got with the Federal plus P 158 grain, that's really close. And so our Hornady Critical Defense achieves that number through high velocity, and our Federal achieves that number through a much heavier projectile. But when you come down to the question of, is the Critical Defense Lite lighter than the Critical Defense? Yes, it's less powerful by a significant margin. Now, when we look at our Spear Gold Dot plus P 135 grain projectile, we see a velocity of 824. Now, by 38 special standards, that might sound impressive. That's 40 feet per second more than we got with the Remington plus P 158 grain. Yes, it's 40 feet per second more, but remember it achieves that with a 135 grain projectile, not a 158 grain projectile. So again, if I've done my math right, that gives us 203 energy foot-pounds, as where our Federal has 212, which would be slightly less than what the Remington got. Now, 203 versus 212, a difference of 9 energy foot-pounds, not enough difference to talk about. And finally, at the bottom of our list, our Federal target ammunition, 38 special 148 grain wad cutter. And we see a velocity of 659 feet per second. 45 feet per second less than what we got with our Remington standard pressure lead round nose. And remember, this achieves that velocity with a 148 grain projectile, not 158. So it makes our wad cutter ammunition really not very powerful at all. But it's only target ammo. It has the word target on the box. And remember, we got really consistent velocities with our wad cutter target ammunition, and the question comes up, would that make any real difference in accuracy? And I'm going to say that if you had a long-barreled real target gun and you put it in some kind of vise, is it going to be more accurate than our other types of ammunition? I'm going to say yes. But the real question in this case would be, with my snub-nose revolver, is it really going to increase the amount of accuracy that I can achieve over what I could achieve with these others? Let's see if we can put that to the test. I have two targets, and I'm going to go back 10 yards and shoot the target on your left with the Federal 148 grain wad cutters and the target on your right with the Remington 158 grain round nose lead. And I'm going to shoot both of these targets with my Smith & Wesson Model 36, which also has a 1 7/8 inch barrel. And let's see how our results compare. And you can see that the wad cutters do cut a very clean hole in the paper. However, for me shooting offhand with my gun, they don't help me shoot any better than the 158 grain round nose lead. Now, perhaps with the right firearm under the right conditions, those wad cutters would be more accurate. But because today we're talking about concealed carry, the results that you can get shooting offhand with your concealed carry firearm are really what's relevant. Now, there's one more point I want to make about accuracy, and this time I'll use my Smith & Wesson Model 638. And I've got 2 new targets set up, and I'll shoot them from 7 yards. And here's our target on the left, in no particular order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not too bad. And here's our target on the right, again in no particular order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And remember, this is the group. This is the flyer. So why the difference in point of impact on the 2 targets? Well, first of all, of course, these were shot with 2 different types of ammunition. I also have to mention that on both targets, my aiming point was right there. Now, the target on your right was shot with the Federal Premium 38 Special Plus P 158 grain Nyclad semi-wad cutter hollow point, and it, like most of the ammunitions I shoot through this particular revolver, patterned significantly high. As where the target on your left was shot with the Hornady Critical Defense 38 Special Plus P 110 grain FTX projectile. And one of the selection criterion in deciding which ammunition to carry in my concealed carry 38 Special revolver is which ammunition hits at least pretty close to where my non-adjustable sights are aligned. And that's a very important part of accuracy. So now, after our discussion and demonstration about accuracy, comparing our wad cutter to our round nose lead, we're back to our chart, and we see that a lot of these numbers vary significantly, a lot of them don't. But as I've said so many times, all of these are just numbers on a piece of paper. How will these numbers translate into effectiveness on the intended target? Let's see if we can put that to the test. So to test our ammunition's effectiveness in the intended target, we're going to use an analog for a thoracic cavity that we call the meat target. And for those who haven't seen it before, the meat target is leather couch skin followed by pork steak pectorals, pork ribs, a bag of oranges to simulate lung tissue, more pork ribs on the back, 4 layers of t-shirt on the front, 4 layers on the back, and the whole thing followed by the new and improved high-tech fleece bullet stop. And I'm going to shoot this from 7 yards with my Smith & Wesson Model 638, which I have loaded with our Remington green and yellow box 38 Special Plus P 158 grain lead semi-wad cutter hollow point. Now, we chronographed this ammunition at a mean velocity of 784 feet per second. And although that is significantly higher velocity than the standard pressure, 784 feet per second is still pretty low velocity. So what we really want to know is, when shooting this target from 7 yards, how much hollow point expansion are we going to get? Let's find out. Well, I've got the meat target taken apart. And as far as the ribs on the front of the target, they just have 38 caliber holes in them where projectiles hit ribs, broke them. We do have some pretty good damage to our orange lung tissue. And the ribs on the back of the target just have slightly larger than 38 caliber holes through them, and none of the projectiles hit a rib on the back of them. Now, as far as penetration, one of the projectiles was stopped by the t-shirt on the back of the target. One made it through to about the 5th layer of fleece, and 2 of them made it through to about the 10th layer of fleece. But our question was, how much hollow point expansion were we going to get from these 38 Special Plus P 158 grain lead semi-wad cutter hollow points? Let's take a close-up look at them. And here's our projectiles, and one has what I'd call mediocre expansion. The rest have expansion that's almost non-existent. So out of my revolver with a 1 7/8 inch barrel, this ammunition wasn't really achieving expansion threshold. Now, a lot of people will ask, what if we used a revolver with a longer barrel? Then yes, depending on the length of the barrel, we would probably get more velocity. However, because in my experience, when people are using a 38 Special for concealed carry, it is most often a snub nose. That's the barrel length that I'm going to consider relevant for today's topic. Now let's try another type of ammo. Now I have a new meat target set up, and I'll shoot this from 7 yards with our Federal Premium 38 Special Plus P 158 grain Nyclad semi-wad cutter hollow point. Now this ammunition was giving us about the same velocity, and the projectile weight is the same, but the bullet is designed a little differently. Let's see if that different design will give us better hollow point expansion. Give me a moment to readjust our target. Let's try a couple more shots. And I've got the meat target taken apart, and again, our ribs on the front of the target just have 38 caliber holes in them. The damage to our orange lung tissue, if anything, is less. And the ribs on the back of the target just have 38 caliber holes in them. Also, in this case, all of our projectiles were stopped by the t-shirt on the back of the target. As where with the Remingtons, some of them penetrated significantly farther into the fleece. But let's take a look at these Federal projectiles. And here's our 158 grain Nyclad semi-wad cutter hollow points with expansion that is minimal to non-existent. So I'm going to have to say nothing premium about this ammunition. Now we have a new meat target set up, and I'll shoot this from 7 yards with our Hornady Critical Defense Lite 38 Special 80 grain FTX projectile, like a ballistic tip. Let's see if I can get any expansion out of this. So I've got the meat target taken apart, and again, the ribs on the front of the target just seem to have 38 caliber holes in them. We do see what appears to be better damage to our orange lung tissue, and our ribs on the back of the target just have slightly bigger than 38 caliber holes through them. Now, all of these projectiles were stopped by the t-shirt on the back of the target or by the first layer of fleece. But let's take a close-up look at these FTX projectiles. And here they are. And this pink you see is the polymer tip that was in the projectile. And we see that at least some of these have what appears to be pretty good expansion. And now we have a new meat target set up, and I'll shoot this from 7 yards with our Hornady Critical Defense regular, which is 38 Special Plus P 110 grain FTX projectile. Now I've got our meat target taken apart, and this is the first one where we've seen damage to the ribs on the front of the target beyond just 38 caliber holes. Looks like we're getting some expansion where projectiles hit ribs, shattered them. We're also seeing what I'd call some significantly greater damage to our orange lung tissue. Now our ribs on the back of the target, by the time the projectiles get here, they've slowed down quite a bit, and we see just slightly larger than 38 caliber holes. And all of our projectiles were stopped by the t-shirt on the back of the target. But let's take a close-up look at these FTX projectiles. And here's our FTX projectiles, and we see very good and quite uniformed expansion. Now we're back to our targets. Remember, I shot the target on your left of the Hornady Critical Defense, and we can see that it hits pretty close to where my non-adjustable sights are aligned. And then I showed you that other ammunitions hit high, and this has been the result I've gotten with just about every ammunition I've shot through this 638, except Hornady Critical Defense. But that brings up the question, what about Hornady Critical Defense Lite? Where will that hit compared to Hornady Critical Defense Regular? Well, I'll put up a new target on your right, shoot it from 7 yards, and let's see what happens. And here's our group from 7 yards, and this one, that really is just me. So here's our group, but it's important to note that anticipating that it would hit high, my aiming point was right here. So it would appear that for me, with this handgun, Hornady Critical Defense and Hornady Critical Defense Lite are both good choices. But it is very important to note that just because these are the results that I get with my handgun does not mean they'll be the same results that you get with your handgun, even if your handgun is a Smith & Wesson Model 638. Each individual handgun might have different results. So a very important part of your ammunition selection process is seeing what kind of accuracy you're going to get with your handgun. Okay, one more meat target. Now I'm loaded with Federal high power, which isn't really high powered, 38 Special 148 grain wad cutter. Let's see what kind of results I get with this. And I've got the meat target taken apart. And with our wad cutters, we see on the ribs on the front of the target some significant damage where projectiles hit ribs, shattered them. We also see what I'm going to call pretty good damage to our orange lung tissue. And our ribs on the back of the target, they're dirty. I dropped them on the ground. We see basically slightly larger than .38 caliber holes. And all of our projectiles were stopped by the t-shirt on the back of the target or by the first layer of fleece. And when I look at the damage in my subjective evaluation of it, it looks like our 148 grain standard pressure wad cutters were doing just as much damage, possibly more, than our plus P 158 grain semi-wad cutter hollow points. Now let's take a close-up look at what our wad cutters look like now. And here you can see our wad cutters have minimal to no expansion, which is about the same result we got from the semi-wad cutter hollow points. Now, an interesting thing about these projectiles, if you look at the back of the bullet, you'll see that it's a hollow base. Makes the projectile a little lighter for its size, and as far as I know, makes it cheaper to manufacture. And there's some old school .38 shooters that will tell you if you want a really good anti-personnel round, get some wad cutter bullets and hand load them backwards so you have a really big hollow point. Now, would that really be effective? Well, there's a lot of things that go into that, including having to hand load your own ammunition, and that's a topic for another time. So the takeaways from all of this, probably many things, but I want to concentrate on just a few. First, if you are using a .38 Special snub-nose revolver for concealed carry personal protection home defense, and you want to get good hollow point expansion, I'm going to say that 158 grain projectiles, probably not what you want to go with. Secondly, our comparison between Hornady Critical Defense, what I'll call regular, versus Hornady Critical Defense Lite. The Lite had a lighter bullet, lower velocity, definitely significantly less recoil, much more pleasant to shoot, but that came at the price of less effectiveness on the intended target. So if you want to get lighter recoil, you're going to give away power. Now the third thing is the idea of the flat-faced wad cutter as a good anti-personnel round. There are many people with many different opinions. Mine is going to be that the flat-faced wad cutter for anti-personnel is something that I'm going to say had merit. Back in the old days, before plus P ammunition, before the modern era of plus P that really does work well in your snub-nose revolvers, before really well-designed hollow points or FTX projectiles, back in the old days that I'll call the Joe Friday days, the idea of carrying a wad cutter for anti-personnel purposes was probably a good idea. Today, not so much with the ammunition technology we have. However, if you have a handgun that is not rated for plus P ammunition, and if you live in a jurisdiction where expanding projectiles are prohibited, then you know that wad cutter might still be a really good idea. But the real bottom line to all of this is you've got to find the right ammunition for you and your firearm. Now, for me, with my Model 638, the right ammunition is Hornady Critical Defense plus P 110 grain FTX projectile, like a ballistic tip. Because it's readily available at my local stores for a reasonable price, I consider it to be effective, and it hits where my non-adjustable sights are aligned. And I know I'm going to repeat this several times, but part of the bottom line of all of this is you have to get yourself and your gun and your ammunition out on the range and make sure that ammo hits where you're aiming it, because not all of them do. So, as always, don't try this at home on what you call a professional, and thanks for watching this installment of 38 Special Concealed Carry Ammunition Selection.